fallen far from their noble beginnings, allowing an obsession with slaughter to twist their bodies and minds. Lurching forwards on tripod bodies, their enmitic annihilators blast victims messily apart as their claws and blades lash out to reap a crimson harvest across the battlefield.
60-million-year-old giant killing robots with swords and guns. Must be time for another midlife crisis. Hello and welcome to another edition of Midlife Crisis. So having spent the last few weeks having a look at the Marines, it was time to go back to the Necrons, and I thought I'd tackle the Skorpekh Lord from the Indomitus set this week. Really cool looking model with lots of swords, guns and claws, so pretty much everything that you want in a giant killing robot. As with all of these, there's lots of cool detail on here. The sprue's already been undercoated with lead belcher, so without further ado, as always, let's put on some tunes and snip some sprues. I've really been looking forward to painting this model. I've spent a bit of time reading up some of the lore, and the Destroyer cult lore really interests me in the Necron mythology. The Skorpekh Lords, Destroyer Lords were the nobles, but they've succumbed now to the corruption in the source code. What little sentience that they had left is completely gone, and they just live for the battle and live for the kill. But as these were sort of nobles, rather than just simply being completely locked down, they're still given a command function. There's our Destroyer Lord now fully assembled. Really cool miniature. It's got really nice details on the base as well as all the weapons. As I've been doing with a lot of these larger models, I'm going to paint this as sub-assemblies. So yeah, let's get on with the paintwork. I've just taken off a few of the key parts so I can get in and start work on the base. Kicking off with Corvus Black, I'm just going to paint in first of all the rocks. I think what I'm going to do is look at some of the rubble, try and give it a more sort of concrete feel, so we'll see how that develops. And with all the rocks painted black, I then moved on to Mechanicus Standard Grey to try to pick out sort of a concrete? Plascrete, I believe they call it. For the actual rubble parts, let's have this as a once imperial building that's been wrecked by the war with the Necrons. Having painted in the main areas of the concrete, there's a number of sections where it's actually been damaged and chipped away, so rather than the dark grey exterior paint job which had been put on the building, I just picked out the damaged areas, or the more damaged areas, and exposed building material using Wraith Bone. Next up, I gave all the rocks a dry brush with Monfang Brown, followed by a second lighter dry brushing with Avland Sunset. Gav Thorpe's book Indomitus, if you've read that, you'll know what I mean, but it really gave some insight into a Destroyer Lord. There were moments of lucidity for him when he remembered that in a previous life before the conversion he was a scientist and he had a family. He was given the luxury of being one of the first few people to be converted, and he promised his family that this was going to be a better life. An end to all the sickness that plagued the Necron people, just to be absolutely horrified by what it actually turned into. There's lots of really cool background on these guys that makes them very interesting, both on and off the tabletop. Once the dry brushing was complete, I covered all the rocks and rubble with Agrax Earthshade as a recess wash. Once the wash had dried, I then switched back to Mechanicus Standard Grey and did a very light dry brush just to put some highlights on the painted concrete areas. And finally I gave it a very light dry brush of Celestria Grey to pick out all the lightened edges of the rubble. With the base now complete, I moved on to painting in all the glowing orbs and sections that I wanted to put the green glow effect on, using Corax White to give a nice crisp surface. As well as the orbs, I also painted in the blade. While that was drying, I then used Retributor armour to paint in all the gold on the model. Quite a lot of gold on this, a much more senior ranked unit, so gold on his weird sort of loinclothy type thing, also on the patterns around his neck and a few other places where I thought it was relevant. I then moved on to all of the pipes and different sort of cables on the miniature. Any cable which had texture on the surface I left in the lead belcher null oil wash combination and just concentrated on all the smooth cables. I started off by giving them a base of Caliban green. Quite a lot of these cables, so it was important to go around and just make sure that I caught them all. I moved on to painting the gun casing with Corvus Black, also picking out a few other details with Corvus Black on blade handles and pieces. Time to move back to the blade, and I just wanted to pick out all of the patterning on the blade, so I did a recessed shade using Beltan green. I just wanted to give everything a good time to dry before moving on to the next layer. It's nice having a large model like this where you can move between bits rather than having to sort of sit twiddling your thumbs till it's dried. That's a point where I always get just way too impatient. I also spent a bit of time because there's a few areas of this which look like power conduits going across the arms and weapons, so I just spent a bit of time picking out all this detail. And with all the recessed shading complete, I then put on a layer of Tesseract Glow across all the blade surface, the Gauss weapon, and all of the power orbs on the miniature. I found through experience that the Tesseract Glow takes about half an hour to dry to the point where you can actually paint over it. While that was drying, I moved on to put all the highlights onto the pipe work. I started off with War Flesh to put in the first layer. I then followed this up with another layer of Warboss green over the top, just moving more to the centre of the cables to have the glowing section so it looks like power's travelling through the cables rather than just the whole lot. I've been doing this now across all the Necron models, and I think I've about settled on this method, although it's more colours and takes more time. I really like the effect that it gives out. And just for the final bit of glowing on that cable right in the sort of centre, I just used Moot Green to really put that sort of finished, sort of lightened area. So now the Tesseract Glow has had enough time to dry, I moved on to the actual bladed weapon. This is the first Necron blade that I've actually painted, so a bit of an experiment on here just to see how to do it. I'd watched a few videos, had a look at the Citadel box art, and this sort of checkered layout seemed to look pretty nice from what I could see, so I thought I'd have an attempt at it. I started off with Warboss Green, picking out the inside centre of the blade and the outside edges, just to try to give that impression of the power flowing around the blade rather than all being concentrated on one spot. I knew that I'd need to do this more as sort of a wet blend, so before the paint had fully dried, I then moved on to a darker War Flesh green and just concentrated more on the outside of the blade, the edges of the blade, and also the very centre part, leaving that lighter colour more moving into the centre. And then finally, the very sort of extreme edges and very middle, I used Caliban green as a very dark green just to put that final darkened piece to try and get those transitions going in. To try to give an impression of sharpness along the edge of the blade, I used Moot Green to add an edge highlight. And once that Moot Green edge highlight had dried, I then went back over it again with Corax White, a much narrower edge highlight, just to really try and make that blade look as sharp as possible. With the glowing effect completed now on the blades, I moved on to do the final bits of detail on the model. I started off with Thousand Suns Blue to give that distinctive blue-gold combination of an Ilex dynasty. I painted up the carapace, the stripe on the face, and also picked out some of the details on the chest and the glyphs surrounding the neck. When picking out the glyphs, I just used the edge of the brush, trying to be very careful not to touch the gold detail on there. Did have to go back and clean this up a few times, so it was back and forth, but the final effect was definitely worth the extra effort. With the blue fully dried, I then used Retributor armour again, first of all just to tidy up some of the areas where I accidentally caught the gold detailing with the blue. Also at that point I'd realised I'd not painted in the face, so using the Retributor armour, picked out all the detail on there. With that fully dried, I then used Agrak Surf Shade, watered down with a bit of line and medium, just to do a recess shade across all of the gold and blue areas on the model. I tried to focus on the recesses and areas that would be naturally in shadow. On the larger areas, I put more focus on the interior sections, trying to leave almost like a natural edge highlight. After leaving that a good while to dry fully, I picked out the eyes with Corax White just to ready them for adding the glowing effect. Much easier to do eyes on these models than on the Space Marines because you don't have to be quite as exact. What I was trying to do was to put in a good base which would then hold the Tesseract glow, but if a little bit of this spills over them that's fine because it looks like the eyes themselves are glowing. I also realised at this point there were a few scarabs on the base, so I painted in the power orbs on those as well so that I could add the Tesseract glow. Off camera, I painted in those scarabs on the base, using Thousand Suns blue for the carapace and Retributor armour for the gold on the faces, and that brought me nicely through to the final stage of the model, which was going back to Tesseract glow, a couple of power orbs on the shoulders and also on the eyes, and those cheeky little scarabs running over the concrete ruins at the base. And there we have it. Apart from just basing the model fully, that's our Skorpekh Lord now, painted up to a battle-ready standard. As you can see, I've completed the base of the miniature using some Citadel texture paints and a bit of dry brushing. What I think I'll do is I'll cover basing in a separate video because I've got a number of different ways that I base my miniatures. The other thing that I also did off camera and looked over the miniature again, I saw a couple of areas where I thought needed a few highlights. I just highlighted up the edges of the claws and also added some highlights to the Enmitic Annihilator that he's holding. Other than that, I'm generally quite pleased with this model. I think the blade didn't quite turn out as well as I hoped it would. I'm going to have a think about this. I think possibly the first layer that I put down wasn't wet enough, so it's ended up looking a little bit blocky. But as they say, practice makes perfect, and with the Indomitus set, I'll have plenty more time to try this again in the future. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please hit the like button. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe, and I'll see you for the next edition of Midlife Crisis.